The movement happened quickly. A few people in the room almost missed it. Not because they weren't paying attention. They were. Every one of them. But there are things that move faster than attention can fully follow, not because they are violent or explosive, but because they are precise. Precise in a way that the eye registers after the fact, the way you sometimes notice a door has closed only once the sound reaches you. Someone in the room spoke up almost immediately. "Can you do that again?" It was a simple question, the kind you ask without thinking, because asking seems obvious. Because in almost every learning environment you've ever been in, that's how it works. You see something, you ask to see it again, and the person teaching obliges. Bruce Lee paused for a moment. Not long, just a breath, and then he said no. The room didn't react dramatically. Nobody gasped. Nobody argued. But something changed in the air. A kind of quiet uncertainty settled in, because the no didn't come with an explanation right away. It just sat there, in the middle of the room, among people who had all fully expected a yes. 3 questions formed, almost simultaneously, in the minds of everyone present. What exactly was the move? Why wouldn't he repeat it? And what were they supposed to do with that? It was a training hall, small by most standards, wooden floors that had absorbed years of footwork, walls that were plain and undecorated, nothing on them to pull your focus. The ceiling was low enough that the room felt contained, intentional, like a space built specifically for close attention. There were no mirrors. That detail matters, in retrospect. Mirrors encourage a certain kind of self-watching, a habit of observing yourself in motion, checking your own form, confirming that what you're doing looks the way it's supposed to look. This room didn't offer that. It asked you to feel what you were doing instead of seeing it. There were roughly a dozen people there that day, maybe a few more. Some were martial artists themselves, people with their own training, their own systems, their own years of accumulated habit and understanding. A few were newer. All of them had come because they wanted to see something they couldn't find in a book or a classroom. The atmosphere was focused, calm, but in the specific way that focused rooms are calm, not relaxed. Exactly. Alert. The kind of quiet where people are conserving attention rather than spending it. Nobody was taking notes. Notes, in a room like this, mean you're watching at one remove. You're translating what you see into language instead of letting it land directly. Most of the people in this room had learned through whatever path had brought them here that some things don't survive translation into language, that the point of being in the room was to be in the room. Bruce Lee wasn't standing at the front of the space the way a teacher stands at a chalkboard. He was somewhere in the middle, and the students were arranged loosely around him, not in rows. More the way people arrange themselves when they're trying to get a clear view from multiple angles. He had been moving for a while already, not demonstrating in a formal sense, working through something. The way a craftsman sometimes works through a problem out loud, not for an audience, but because the thinking happens in the doing. The students had been watching his hands, his feet, the way his weight distributed before any visible movement began. They had learned, in rooms like this, that the thing you see is often the last part of the thing. That movement begins somewhere deeper in the shift of weight, in the rotation of a hip, in a decision made before the body commits. If you watched only the hands, you were always a half-second behind. The mood in the room was that of people trying to watch earlier and earlier in the sequence, trying to catch the moment before the moment. He was working through something about angle, about how the position you occupy relative to another person determines what is and isn't possible. How a small change, a matter of inches, doesn't just change the available techniques. It changes the entire geometry of an encounter. What used to be a vulnerability becomes a neutrality. What used to be a strong line becomes an exposed one. He shifted. It wasn't a large movement. That's the first thing to understand. There was no leap, no dramatic repositioning. He moved perhaps 6 inches, maybe less to the side, and in that same motion, without any visual gap between the shift and what followed, his forearm rotated and his shoulder dropped by a fraction, and the line of force that had been directed at him was no longer directed at anything in particular. It was over very quickly. The students caught the shape of it, the general outline of what had happened, but the detail was still settling. You know that feeling of watching something and understanding it, and not quite understanding it at the same time, where the mind says, yes, I saw that, but another part of the mind immediately says, but what did I actually see? That's what the room was sitting with. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed. Not confusion exactly, more like the collective processing of something that had passed too quickly to be fully absorbed in real time. People were running it back internally, trying to reconstruct the sequence from whatever their attention had managed to catch. The movement had been small. That was the part that kept surfacing for most of them. They had been prepared, trained, even to watch for big movements, for the obvious expressions of technique. What they'd seen was quiet, understated almost to the point of invisibility, and yet the effect of it was undeniable. Something about the combination of those two things, the smallness of the movement and the completeness of the effect, created a kind of cognitive friction. It didn't fit the category they'd put it in. A few of the more experienced students were nodding slowly, the way people nod when they've glimpsed something they recognize but couldn't have named beforehand. The newer ones were slightly more unsettled, not troubled, just aware that something had happened that they didn't yet have the framework to fully receive. The room held the moment for a few seconds. One of the students leaned forward slightly. He was one of the more experienced ones. He wasn't asking carelessly. He'd been watching carefully, and the question came from a genuine place, from wanting to understand, not from wanting to be shown something impressive. Could you do that again? It was a natural thing to ask. Completely natural. If you're trying to learn a movement, trying to understand a principle through watching, seeing it once is rarely enough. You need the second pass. The third, sometimes. You need to watch different parts of it at different times, building up a composite picture from multiple viewings. That's how most physical learning works. That's the model everyone in the room had been using for years. The request made sense. You could feel the rest of the room respond to it, not vocally, but in body language. A few people subtly repositioned themselves, adjusted their angle, readied their attention. There was a collective leaning in, the room preparing to receive the movement again with sharper focus. Everybody assumed the answer was going to be yes. The question was just how many times he'd be willing to repeat it. Bruce Lee looked at the student for a moment. Not blankly, not coldly. There was something in the look, a brief consideration maybe, or maybe just the ordinary pause between hearing something and responding to it. Then he said, "No, just the word. Quiet, matter of fact." The same register as everything else he'd said in the room that day. The student didn't push back. He didn't look offended. He looked, if anything, slightly puzzled, the way you look when something that should be simple turns out not to be. The rest of the room sat with the refusal for a moment. Nobody argued. The relationship in the room wasn't one where arguing would happen, not out of intimidation, but out of genuine respect. These were people who had come to learn something, and they understood, on some level, that the learning might not always come in the shape they expected. But the confusion was real. It wasn't hostile confusion. It was the confusion of people trying to fit a piece into a picture and not quite finding where it belongs. The request had been so ordinary, so in keeping with how learning usually works. The refusal didn't fit. Someone almost asked a follow-up question. You could sense it, the slight intake of breath, the weight shift. But the question didn't come. The room chose to wait instead. There's a kind of intelligence in that, in knowing when to hold a question instead of releasing it. Most of the people in that room had been in enough learning environments to know that sometimes the space after an unexpected moment is where the real information arrives. So the room waited, and the silence wasn't awkward, it was attentive. What Bruce Lee said next didn't arrive as a speech. It wasn't framed as a lesson. He didn't adopt a different posture or shift into a different mode. He spoke the way someone speaks when they're explaining something they've thought about for a long time but don't feel the need to perform. He explained, briefly and without drama, why the question, reasonable as it was, didn't quite fit the thing being asked about. The movement, he said, wasn't something that could be extracted from the moment it had lived in and placed somewhere else without losing the thing that made it real. It had worked. It had been what it was because of the specific conditions surrounding it. The timing, the entry point, the particular alignment of position and situation. These weren't secondary details. They weren't the context around the technique. They were the technique. The thing people thought they had seen, the rotation of the forearm, the drop of the shoulder, the 6-inch shift that was the surface. Underneath it was a specific set of conditions that made those surface elements mean something. Strip away the conditions and repeat only the surface, and you have a different thing entirely. It would look the same to someone watching. Same shape, same sequence, but a repeated movement performed on command, in stillness, against no actual pressure or situation. That movement isn't demonstrating the principle. It's imitating the demonstration of the principle. And those are not the same thing. He put it simply. If he did it again right now, you'd be watching him perform a movement. You wouldn't be seeing the reason the movement works, because the reason the movement works has already passed. The room was very quiet, not the same quiet as before. Before, the quiet was attentive people gathering focus. This quiet was something else. The particular stillness that comes when an idea lands in a way that takes a moment to settle. The more experienced students in the room were the first to arrive somewhere with it. You could see it in small adjustments, a slight relaxation in the jaw, a slow exhale. Not the satisfaction of having been told something they already knew. More the recognition of something they had felt the edges of before, now articulated clearly for the first time. The newer students were still working through it. But even for them, something had shifted. The refusal had stopped being strange. It had started being clarifying. Because once you hear it that way, once you understand that certain principles depend entirely on timing, on surprise, on the unrepeatable alignment of a specific moment, the request to repeat the movement starts to look different, not unreasonable, just based on a misunderstanding of what the movement was doing. The movement wasn't a form to be memorized. It wasn't a technique to be catalogued. It was a response to a specific set of circumstances, and the response was inseparable from the circumstances that called it into being. Repeating it would have been answering a question that was no longer being asked. There's a category of knowledge, and this room was full of people who worked in that category that lives in the body before it lives in the mind. That arrives through experience before it can be understood through explanation. The way you can read about balance for years and still not know balance until you've lost it unexpectedly and recovered. The reading tells you what to look for. The experience gives you something else, something that doesn't have a clean name. What Bruce Lee was pointing toward was something in that territory, not the movement, the recognition of when the movement is called for, the sensitivity to timing that turns a simple shift of position into something that works. That's not a technique. It's closer to a capacity, and capacities are developed through encounter, not through watching a demonstration twice. The student who had asked the question sat with all of this. He wasn't embarrassed that he'd asked. The question had been honest, but he could feel working through the explanation that he'd been looking for the answer in the wrong place, that what he'd been trying to capture with a second viewing wasn't really capturable that way, that the second viewing would have given him more data about the shape of the movement when the shape was never really the point. Nobody in the room spoke for a moment. Then the session continued. He didn't repeat the movement. The rest of the time in the room proceeded as it had before, with the same focused quiet, the same careful attention. But the texture of the attention had changed. People were still watching his hands and his feet, but they were also watching something harder to name: the space around the movement, the conditions, the before. They were learning to watch earlier in the sequence. Not everyone left with a full understanding. That would be too clean. These are the kinds of things that settle slowly, sometimes over years, often through experience that confirms the principle in a way that explanation alone never quite reaches. But the refusal had done something. It had reoriented the question, had taken it from what was that movement, and shifted it towards something more useful, something closer to what are the conditions in which that movement becomes possible. And that second question is a much more productive place to spend your attention if what you're after is genuine understanding. There's a version of learning that treats knowledge as a series of fixed objects, things to be observed, replicated, stored. You watch the movement, you copy the movement, you own the movement. Clean and sequential. There's real value in that approach. Plenty of things actually work that way. But there's another version, where the thing being learned is less like an object and more like a relationship. A relationship between a person and a moment, between awareness and timing, between sensing what's present and responding to it in a way that's real rather than rehearsed. And that version of learning doesn't yield to the first approach. You can't watch it often enough and then replicate it. You have to develop the sensitivity that makes it possible, and that happens through different means entirely. What the room received that day wasn't a technique. It was a way of understanding what techniques are for, and it arrived quietly, without drama, not in the movement itself, but in the refusal to repeat it. He left the moment exactly where it belonged, and the room, for a long time after, kept thinking about it,